Hi, my name is Dale Maley. Today I'd like to tell you one of the forgotten stories about Livingston County, Illinois. Dates clear back to 1869, but it's a fascinating tale about a older surveyor who takes a bunch of young men with him and end up getting mostly killed by the Sioux Indians out in Nebraska. So let's get started with our story. Way back in 1869, this story actually made the national newspapers. And I'm going to tell you the general narrative of the story that newspaper readers saw across the United States. So Nelson Buck was a surveyor. The story was he took a party of 12 boys aged 16 and under to Nebraska to survey. And his surveying party was just minding their own business when all of a sudden the Sioux Indians murdered the whole party. The only survivors were two young Pontiac boys that they sent back to the army fort to get help after they first saw the Indians. As we'll find out, quite a bit of this narrative was not true. Now, some of the questions that I had and I researched, I'm going to review those for you during this presentation. For example, just who was Nelson Buck, and were the boys he hired all age 16 and under? Who were the two survivors? Why in the world did they go surveying in Nebraskan Indian country with no firearms and no military escort? And was it really an unprovoked attack by the Sioux Native American tribe? Now, whenever I research for a history story, one of the things I always do is do the family tree back to Europe when they first came to America. In the case of Nelson Buck, his ancestors really came over to America very early, around 1635. I'm not going to run through all the family tree here, but the parents of Henry Buck were a very unusual first name for the husband, Aholiab Buck. Never heard. Aholiab is such an unusual first name that I looked it up, and it's actually a biblical name. He was the son of, and this is just about as hard to pronounce, Ahisamach of the tribe of Dan, worked under Bezaliah as the deputy architect of the tabernacle and the implements which it housed, including the Ark of the Covenant. He is described in Exodus 38:23 as a master of carpentry, weaving, and embroidery. Now, in Nelson Buck's family, there was a total of 9 children, and all 9 are listed here, but we're really interested in Nelson Buck, who is child number 3, and he lived from 1808 until 1869. And Nelson Buck was actually married 3 different times. First one was Fidelia Wethy, I'm going to pronounce it, 1814 to 1833. Then Annis Knapp from 1812 to 1844. And his third marriage was Maria Tracy from 1812 to 1909. Nelson Buck's parents were actually pioneer settlers in Peoria, Illinois. And Nelson Buck married in New York about the time that his parents moved to Peoria. Unfortunately, Nelson Buck's young wife soon died. Now let's take a look at the family tree of Nelson Buck and his first wife, Fidelia. They actually had 2 children. However, it's unclear to me, Clarissa Buck, it's unclear if she was the daughter of Nelson Buck's first wife or second wife. And he also had a son named Oliver Perry Buck. But what happened was Oliver changed his name to Oliver Perry Wethy in 1853 and stayed out in the New York area when Nelson Buck went to Illinois. And then Oliver married Mariette Halston and had 5 children. Now, communications weren't that great, say, in the 1830s and 40s. So I suspect that Nelson Buck never really knew that he had 5 grandchildren living out in New York. Nelson Buck opened the very first nursery and orchard in Bloomington, Illinois, and he opened that in 1833. He later ran ads in the Pantagraph newspaper for selling trees and plants, and those ads still exist in the Pantagraph archives today. Now, there was some type of connection between Abraham Lincoln and Nelson Buck. Now, Abe Lincoln was also a surveyor just for a year or two from 1833 to 1834, and he surveyed mostly around the Springfield area. Nelson Buck, on the other hand, learned surveying around 1833 in the Peoria area. Nelson Buck did use the dead Abraham Lincoln as a reference in 1868 when he applied for a Nebraska surveying job. I'm not really sure how they knew each other. However, Nelson Buck was at a surveyors convention where Lincoln was one of the key speakers, and maybe they met there. Now let's take a look at Nelson Buck and his second wife. He married her in 1834. Her name was Annis Knapp. They had two children that died as infants, Alice and Edwin Buck, and then a son who lived to adulthood, Willard P. Buck, and then a daughter, Cordelia. Now, Willard never married, but he was a Civil War veteran. Cordelia married a local Pontiac guy, Charles E. Watson, and they had three children, which would be the three grandchildren of Nelson Buck. Now let's talk for a little bit about Nelson Buck's third wife, Maria Tracy. She actually married Augustus Fellow out in New York, and they were some of the earliest Pontiac citizens between 1840 and 1843. And he owned a lot of the original building lots in Pontiac, but they sure had bad luck having children. 1843, a daughter died at 5 months. The next year, a daughter died aged 6 years. Son died shortly after birth, and a daughter died shortly after birth. And then, after losing 4 children, her husband died in 1849 when she was 53 years of age. When her husband died, she was 47 when she became a widow. Nelson Buck's second wife died in 1844 at just the age of 31, and he would have been 35 when his second wife died. The surviving children at that time were Willard, age 7, Cordelia, age 5, and Clarissa, age 12. In the 1848 Pantograph, Nelson Buck ran an ad for his nursery, and I had to redraw the ad. It wasn't in the best of shape, so this is very similar to the original ad, but it's a readable version. The ad was Central Nursery. Now's the time for those who wish to have good fruit to purchase the trees. At this establishment, there is a good assortment of apple, pear, and peach trees, and a few grape roots, all of which will be sold on terms to accommodate purchasers. I expect to keep a hand constantly in the nursery to attend to calls in this line. Nelson Buck, March 24th, 1848. Now, there were at least 3 other men from Livingston County who traveled across Nebraska. In 1849, William T. Stackpole, who was in Fairbury real estate later, he walked across Nebraska going to the California Gold Rush. In 1849, he actually found gold, and he returned via Nicaragua because there was no Panama Canal back then. A second guy actually made 3 trips, 1849, 1852, and 1859. Judge Henry Jones made 3 trips across Nebraska to California before he finally moved to California. His Jones house still stands today in Pontiac. In 1865, A.J. Cropsey, who was a Civil War hero from Fairbury, he actually moved to Lincoln, Nebraska after the war and became a big-time real estate developer. So it was a small world in those days, so I'm pretty sure that Nelson Buck actually knew all 3 of those guys who traveled and survived in Nebraska. Nelson Buck married for the 3rd time in 1850, and he married Maria Tracy, the widow of Augusta Fellows in Pontiac. Now, Nelson was 42, and she was 38 when they married, and they had no children. Nelson's children from the previous marriage included 13-year-old Willard, 11-year-old Cordelia, and 18-year-old Clarissa. And Nelson Buck moved to Pontiac sometime around 1850. Also in 1850, Clarissa Buck, who was the daughter of Nelson Buck, died in Pontiac on July 18, 1851. She was only 19 years of age. She was buried in Pontiac's Southside Cemetery with her sister, Cordelia, and Cordelia's husband. Now here's a copy of an ad that Nelson Buck ran in the Pantograph multiple times in 1852 and 1853. And he was advertising that he was a land agent and he did surveying. And what's interesting is some of his references included the Honorable David Davis from Bloomington, Illinois. His mansion still survives in Bloomington, and he was a friend and big advocate of Abraham Lincoln becoming president. Now bear with me with this part of the story because it is confusing. But about the time Nelson Buck got married for the third time and went to Pontiac, there was a big legal mess in Pontiac about ownership of the early lots in Pontiac. So two young brothers settled in Pontiac, but they both died before they legally owned the lots. Henry Weed entered the land in his name, and then Isaac Fellows was a brother-in-law to the young brothers. So ownership changed to Henry Weed and Isaac Fellows, but then Fellows died and left land to his son Augustus Fellows. And at that point, Henry Weed owned half of Pontiac, and Augustus Fellows owned the other half. Then Henry Weed dies, leaving it to his son and two son-in-laws. But then Augustus Fellows dies, and his widow was Nelson Buck's third marriage. What a mess. Because of Nelson Buck's surveying experience and land ownership experience, he helped to resolve the big legal controversy around 1853. Now, it used to be when you bought a house, you got a complete title abstract, and that gave ownership history clear back to who first bought the land from the U.S. government. But they got to be 50 to 100 pages long, and they were discontinued around 1968. If you're fortunate enough to have a house, say in Pontiac, and you have this complete title abstract, it can be really confusing when you look at old houses in Pontiac because of this big real estate controversy. Shortly after Nelson Buck got the big legal controversy cleared up in Pontiac, in 1853, he ran for the position of county surveyor, but he lost. But he was involved with building a new bridge across the Vermilion River in Pontiac, and he surveyed and laid out the village of Dwight. In 1854, he ran for election again as county surveyor, but lost. In 1855, he was involved with banning the sale of alcohol in Pontiac. Now, in 1856 was a big year in terms of Pontiac history. The village was incorporated under the laws of the state of Illinois February 12, 1856, and they elected the first board of trustees. And Nelson Buck was actually voted to be the chairman of the first board of Pontiac trustees. And on that board was Nelson Buck, Jason Stravell, S.C. Ladd, Zealous H. Nettleton, and Henry Jones. And then some of these names live on today. Henry Jones built the Jones House in Pontiac, which still stands. And then Z.H. Nettleton built the Stravell House, but he died shortly after he built it. Jason Stravell then basically doubled the size of the house. It still stands and is called the Stravell House today. In 1856 in Pontiac, the old tavern that was owned by Nelson Buck burned down. Interesting though, that tavern never served any alcohol because he didn't believe in serving alcohol. Now in 1857 he was finally elected the county surveyor, and there's also one mention of him possibly being a postmaster at Pontiac. In 1859 he surveyed and laid out the village of Chatsworth, kind of south and east of Pontiac. In 1861 the Civil War started, and Nelson Buck's son Willard Buck served in the Union Army. In 1863 Nelson Buck surveyed and laid out the Pontiac Southside Cemetery. In 1864 his daughter Cordelia Buck married Charles E. Watson in Pontiac. Then he became a grandfather in 1864 when he was 56 years of age. The next year, in 1865, Buck was one of the founders of the Chicago and Paducah Railroad. Same year, A.J. Cropsey, the Fairbury Civil War hero, went to Lincoln, Nebraska to be a big-time real estate developer. And in 1867, Nebraska became a state. Now let's try to put ourselves in the shoes of Nelson Buck in terms of his life stage in 1868. He would have been 60 years old. He had been a pioneer settler in Peoria, Bloomington, and Pontiac. He was one of the founding fathers of Pontiac. He was president of the first board of trustees in Pontiac. He was elected county surveyor several times, but there wasn't too much demand for surveyors because 1852 to 1860 was the big land rush in Livingston County. After 1860, all the land had been claimed. It had been 3 years since the Civil War ended in 1865, but it would still be 3 more years until Custer made his last stand in 1876. Nelson Buck was enjoying his first grandchild, and 2 more would be born just a few years later. His son Willard, the Civil War veteran, had actually moved to Michigan, and Nelson Buck had 2 brothers and a sister living in the Kansas-Nebraska area. Now continuing looking at his life stage in 1868, Nebraska had just become a state 1 year earlier in 1867. There was a great demand for surveyors in Nebraska since it was a new state. Nelson Buck still needed to provide income for himself and his wife because there was no Social Security or old age pensions available in that day. So he decided to go surveying in the dangerous Nebraska Indian country at the age of 60. So in December of 1867, Nelson Buck applied for a job to the Nebraska State Surveyor General, but the Surveyor General rejected his application because of potential Indian problems. That did not deter Mr. Buck because in February of 1868, he applied for that surveying job in Nebraska a second time, and that time he got the job. So what did Nelson Buck say that second time around to actually get the job to the Surveyor General? I'm going to take a minute to read it because this is a critical part of the story. As to the trouble with the Indians, I expected to encounter all ills. I am no more prepared to be killed than others are, but I think I am just as unlikely to suffer from their depredations as others, and am able to employ such force as will be likely to protect a party of surveyors as others are. In fact, that part will not deter me from taking my chance. It is not for profit alone that would induce me to make the attempt, but the desire to be employed where I can see the West. So then, so far as the fear of Indians are concerned, that has little or no way in this matter. Buck continued to argue that, he said, I can procure all the necessary assistance and arms for defense as against the Indians, and I can perform the work as well as any other man. As my long practice in surveying, I can say without fear of successful contradiction, has given me a knowledge of all the various plans that must be carried out, and I'm anxious to be engaged in this business. Now the story is that Nelson Buck took out a local newspaper ad for his expedition, and he recruited young men and for an adventure out west. Unfortunately, I searched all the local newspapers, and I cannot find a copy of that 1869 ad. One of the young men that went on Nelson Buck's surveying expedition was Harry McGregor, and in his 1937 obituary, it recounted that a total of 5 young Pontiac men accompanied Nelson Buck to Nebraska. They included Harry McGregor, John Nettleton, Frank McFarland, James Sager, and Will McCulloch. However, there's still some discrepancies as to who exactly went on the trip, but this is probably the best list that exists. And that Harry McGregor's obituary reported the 5 boys and Nelson Buck left Pontiac on June 29, 1869 for Nebraska. The obituary also reported that none of the 5 boys were over the age of 16. Well, my studies indicate this is incorrect because John Nettleton was 20 years of age and Harry McGregor himself was 17. The Nelson Buck party got to an army fort in Nebraska where he asked the army to provide escorts, guns, and ammunition. but the commander at the army at the fort refused all of Buck's requests. He waited around a couple days at the fort, but then decided to leave the fort and actually start surveying. One has to wonder, maybe he had no money left to get everybody back home to Pontiac. Don't really know why he decided to go on without army escorts, guns, or ammunition. A couple days after leaving the army fort in Nebraska, Nelson Buck's party did see some Indians. So Buck sent two of the boys, Harry McGregor and John Nettleton, back to the fort to get some help. When the boys got there, though, the army said, "No, we're not going to send anybody out immediately." So the two boys wisely decided to stay at the fort and not try to rejoin the surveying party. And the two boys eventually traveled safely back to Pontiac. By September 26, 1869, the U.S. Army pretty much knew that the Buck party had been killed. A Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Duncan made a report where he said Indians killed one, Indians captured one, and he went on to say they pursued the Indians to their village consisting of 56 lodges, which was destroyed the following day. From the Indian prisoner, it was ascertained that the band were all Sioux, under Pawnee, Killer, and Whistler. Some surveyor's instruments were also found and identified as belonging to Mr. Nelson Buck's surveying party, consisting of about 12 persons, all of whom have been recently murdered and their camp destroyed. The first newspaper article that I could find about the Nelson Buck Massacre was published October 14, 1869. Reports are received here that a government surveying party under Nelson Buck, numbering 12 men, were massacred about 50 miles south of Fort McPherson. The surveying instruments, tools, and a portion of the camp equipment owned by the party were found. The reports are credited but lack full confirmation. I found one newspaper article using the terminology of that era from an Indian squaw. She reported that some white men attacked a scouting party and killed some Indians. The survivors of the scouting party went back to the main tribe. The main tribe then wiped out the surveying party. Now, her account was not widely published in all the newspapers. It only appeared in one account, and I'm just guessing that her account was not given much weight. A son of Nelson Buck, as you remember, was a veteran of the Civil War. When his father disappeared, he went out to Nebraska to look for his father. The Army escorted him out, and they found some personal items from Nelson Buck. So the son concluded the whole party had been murdered, and he went back to Pontiac. The wife of Nelson Buck, his third wife from Pontiac, she actually went to Nebraska looking for her husband. We recently found a rare copy of her letter from Nebraska back to her daughter in Pontiac in the Historical Society archives. For those of us not familiar with Nebraska geography, where did the Nelson Buck Massacre take place? Well, here's a map of Nebraska. The solid red line down there is the Kansas-Nebraska borderline. And you see the red dot there close to Marion, Nebraska. So the site of the Nelson Buck Massacre was in southern central Nebraska near Marion. There are many newspaper articles that were published from the McCook, Nebraska town. Now here's an interesting twist to the Nelson Buck Massacre story. We have a new character, very colorful. Buffalo Bill Cody enters the story. His name was actually William Frederick Cody. He was known as Buffalo Bill. He was an American soldier, bison hunter, and showman. Some of you may not be familiar with Buffalo Bill Cody. He was one of the most famous and well-known figures of the American West. He started his legend when he was only 23 years of age. Shortly thereafter, he started performing in shows that displayed cowboy themes and episodes from the frontier and the Indian Wars. He founded Buffalo Bill's Wild West Group in 1883, taking his very large company of entertainers on tours in the United States, and beginning in 1887, he even put on shows in Europe. In April of 1872, which would have been about 2.5 years after the massacre, he wrote a letter to the mother of Mrs. McFarlane, whose son was killed by the Indians. A copy of Buffalo Bill's letter was published in the Pontiac Sentinel newspaper. In his 1872 letter, Buffalo Bill reported that he had investigated the massacre. He really criticized Willard Buck, the son of Henry Buck, for not continuing to search for his father's remains. He said that once Willard, the son, saw a couple of his father's personal items, he gave up the search and went back to Pontiac. Buffalo Bill said he told Willard he would continue investigating himself. In his letter, Buffalo Bill Cody said he found a bend in the creek where the massacre happened, and he planned on returning to that area and promised to properly bury any remains that he found. Mrs. McFarlane, mother of one of the dead young men, actually moved from Pontiac to the Braidwood area by 1880. At that point, Buffalo Bill put on a show in Streator, north of Pontiac. Mrs. McFarlane traveled to Streator to meet with Buffalo Bill. He told her that about 3 years after the massacre, while scouting the plains, he came upon the bleached bones of 9 of the bodies, and he had them carefully buried. In 1909, Buffalo Bill Cody sent a letter to the editor of the Pontiac Daily Leader newspaper. In 1909 marked 40 years since the Nelson Buck surveying party disappeared in 1869 in Nebraska. The headline for his letter was, "Says he recovered the bodies and all were given respectable burial at Plum Creek, Nebraska." Now let's advance the time clock ahead to 1936, which would have been 67 years after the massacre in Nebraska. In 1936, a Mr. Brookings of Hastings, Nebraska, was researching the Nelson Buck expedition story. He exchanged several letters with Harry McGregor in Pontiac. Now back in 1936, Harry was 85 years of age and lived in Pontiac. His wife Emma had died on August 31st, 1936. Since the Henry Buck expedition was in 1869, Harry was recalling events that had occurred 67 years earlier. Harry died about 19 months after this article was published. In these letters, Harry McGregor recounted that Nelson Buck was in quite a quandary. He was told that in a country infested with hostile Indians, it was suicide to go on, but without funds and the expense of caring for his party, he had no choice. It was a situation to daunt the stoutest of hearts. After about a week at the fort, they decided to go on, hoping that an escort of cavalry would follow. They traveled for 2 days, finally reaching the Republican River near the present west edge of Harlan County. Sager and one of the McFarlane boys had openly boasted that they were going to shoot the first Indians they saw, and it was not long until they had the chance. Mr. McGregor recounted that the evening of their arrival at the Republican River, 2 of the boys went some distance from the camp where they met or overtook 2 Indians. One of these was promptly shot by Sager, but the other gun missed fire and the second Indian escaped. The bow, arrows, and other personal equipment was stripped from the corpse and taken into the buck camp where they were exhibited. Harry McGregor recounted that Nelson Buck was greatly disturbed by what happened because he was smart enough to know that this foolhardy act might precipitate a world of trouble with the Indians, so he decided to send Nettleton and McGregor back to the fort to make a last plea for an escort or additional arms. Every history story always has some unsolved mysteries, so let's take a look at a few of these unsolved mysteries. Why did Nelson Buck want to go from Pontiac to survey in the dangerous country in Nebraska at the age of 59? When he first wrote his first letter to the Nebraska Surveying General in 1867, he was 59 years of age. When he got the contract and left Pontiac for Nebraska on June 29, 1869, he was 61 years old. In that era, most men that lived to be that age were content with working as long as they could or retire and enjoy their grandchildren. Another mystery, why did Nelson Buck want to go from Pontiac to survey in the dangerous country in Nebraska at the age of 59? In one of Nelson Buck's letters to the Surveyor General of Nebraska, he said, "It is not the profit alone that would induce me to make the attempt, but the desire to be employed where I can see the West." So maybe Nelson Buck knew his days were numbered, and he wanted to have one last adventure before. Why did Harry McGregor not mention that detail about the Buck party first shooting at the Sioux Indians until he was very late in his life? I'm going to assume the reason that Harry McGregor never mentioned the Buck party initiated the conflict with the Sioux was because it made a much better story to leave out this detail. Another unsolved mystery, why did Nelson Buck recruit young Pontiac boys to go on his Nebraska surveying expedition? Because they had no military training and they had no experience with Native American conflicts. In retrospect, my question would be, why didn't he hire Civil War veterans? So some of my closing thoughts on this story. It is a very tragic story. Nelson Buck was a pioneer settler and surveyor in Peoria, Bloomington, and Pontiac, Illinois. He was a major contributor to the success of Pontiac growing and becoming a successful town. The young Pontiac men that he recruited to join his expedition were likely between the ages of 16 and 20. Except for John Nettleton and Harry McGregor, these young men tragically lost their lives. Not only did the Pontiac young men lose their lives, the Nebraska men who joined the expedition also tragically lost their lives. The true story of what happened after Nettleton and McGregor left the party to go back to the fort for help will likely never be known. Over 150 years after the incident, all we have is bits and pieces of information about this story. In retrospect, the tragedy was likely caused because Nelson Buck was overconfident and he had no experience dealing with Native Americans. If Nelson Buck had really understood the risk of conflict with Native Americans, he would have trained his young men not to initiate any conflicts. If you want to know more information, I wrote a book about this story, and my hope is the book will help inform future generations about the history of the Nelson Buck Surveying Party in Nebraska in 1869. Here's a photo of the cover of the book that I wrote, The Massacre of the Nelson Buck Party from Pontiac, Illinois. I donate copies to the Pontiac, Illinois Library. You can check out a copy there. You can also get either a printed copy or a Kindle ebook version from Amazon.com. We also keep some printed copies of the book at the Stravell House in Pontiac for sale to the public. When I give a history talk, the last slide always asks the audience if they have questions. I hope you enjoyed this story, and if you want more information, check out my book. It has all the details involved. I just pulled out the highlights for this presentation. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe, and thanks for watching.